Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Galucki, and welcome to the 424th Imagine Greater Buffalo program, and another wonderful virtual Imagine lecture hosted by the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. This 10-week summer series focuses on creating a culture of sustainability. In effect, what would a sustainable community look like? Our speakers come from the academic community as well as the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Thank you so much for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art and Architecture, History and Nature, or C-SAAHN as I like to pronounce the acronym, as well as ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Now, we're going to start with our speakers shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted. Our speaker's presentation will last, which will last about 15 minutes. We'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again later on the library's Facebook and YouTube channels. And we hope you'll share the link with your networks. As a reminder, Life Willing will be here on Zoom every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. with a great lineup of local speakers. Now, today's featured speaker is Dr. Susan Clark. Dr. Clark is an assistant professor in the Department of Environment and Sustainability at the University at Buffalo, where she teaches and conducts research on sustainability and community resilience topics. Dr. Clark also currently is chair of the Erie County Community Climate Change Task Force, which serves as an advisory group to the county on climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives. She holds a PhD in sustainability from Arizona State University, a master's degree in Earth System Science from the University of New Hampshire, and a bachelor's degree from SUNY Albany in atmospheric science. Dr. Clark was born and raised in the Albany area of New York State and now lives with her husband and daughter in Fairport, New York. So now let's welcome Dr. Susan Clark. Susan?
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that. So just bear with me here as I share my slides. Get set up. So hopefully you're seeing my slides here. Just restart.
We are.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Now just make sure I can see all of you. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited about this opportunity to share with you some of the work that I've been doing very closely with Erie County in conducting their climate vulnerability assessment. Now, as Dennis kind of alluded to, I work very broadly in the space of sustainability, community resilience, climate change. And so when I was speaking with JD Hartman about, what to focus on in this talk, there were sort of lots of things that came up that I could have talked about. Climate vulnerability assessment just seemed maybe the most appropriate, given that apparently last week, Bonnie Lawrence from Erie County Department of Environment and Planning gave a talk, and she actually mentioned this climate vulnerability assessment. And so today I'll give you a little bit more detail about that project. And just before I sort of jump in here, I also wanted to mention that this is kind of a unique opportunity for the University of Buffalo because we're collaborating so closely with the county outside, partners that are outside of academia. And so we have our students really involved in this project, getting this experience working off campus. And so they're not just doing this work where they're turning a report and it just, gets a grade. It's actually work that's contributing to making an impact on the local community and informing decision-making locally as well. So I'm seeing that you're not seeing my slides, so let me reshare this again.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so I thought I'd start off with just saying, what is the climate vulnerability assessment? That term might be new to some of you. So a climate vulnerability assessment, you can think about it as the first step to understanding how resilient we are to the changes coming our way due to climate change. At the most basic level, this type of assessment will help us understand the types of threats and hazards that might affect our area in the future. The assessment also assumes that climate change does not affect all of us or the systems like our infrastructure equally. And so therefore performing an assessment of local vulnerabilities can help us identify and prioritize actions to reduce risks to the community. And this is exactly what we're trying to do in collaboration with Erie County. So who's funding this work? So our work is funded by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation through a program that they have called Climate Smart Communities. It's essentially a statewide program that funds both climate mitigation and climate adaptation work, and allows communities and municipalities across the state almost to compete for certifications that they work for in this climate space. So the climate vulnerability assessment is just one of many different types of projects and initiatives that are happening across the state and at Erie County to sort of work towards a more sustainable and resilient future for our region. So here's our wonderful team. I'm presenting on behalf of many people. So the person that we work most closely with at Erie County is Josh Wilson. He's kind of like the project manager. But a lot of the assessment and analysis is happening at UB. And so I'm leading that effort along with Dr. Chris Rentschler, who's in the Department of Geography. Then we have a number of students highlighted at the bottom of the slide, which I won't take the time to go through them each individually, but if you look, they each bring sort of their own expertise and knowledge and really have contributed heavily to this project. Especially, I will say, Jonathan Townsend, he's the PhD student on this project and really works on this day to day and has contributed a lot of effort here as well. So lots of people coming in to work on this assessment in a collaborative fashion. All right, so this is the framework that we're using to conduct the climate vulnerability assessment for the county. And I'll try to keep this pretty high level, but this framework is something that's used pretty widely throughout the state, but also you see it in like published scholarly literature as well. So I'll just go through the different phases and then I'm going to talk you through some of the results from each of these phases of the project. So in phase one, you're seeing all the way on the left in orange is exposure. So here's basically where we review the different types of threats and hazards that the county may be vulnerable due to climate change. I'll show you the results of that here in a second. The second phase is sensitivity. So this is where we're trying to understand the degree to which the county as an organization and the community in terms of residents are sort of exposed and impacted by different threats. The third phase is adaptive capacity. And this is really where we are in the process right now of this assessment. And this is looking at what capacity do we have to mitigate the impacts of the threats and hazards headed our way. And it's really the combination of all of these phases that then determine our overall vulnerability to climate threats and hazards. I also wanted to note, you can see the bright orange stakeholder engagement arrow across the top of the slide. And this is really important because our project has very heavy stakeholder engagement. Every month we report our work to the Erie County Climate Change Task Force. And we also have representatives throughout the county from the different departments that are heavily engaged in talking to us about this project as well. So it's not just UB off sort of in its corner doing the work. We're having constant conversations and getting feedback from our stakeholders to make sure the work that we do is useful and relevant to the county. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of information about the results for these different phases. So the first is exposure, again, identifying key hazards to the county due to climate change. So this is kind of like the results slide of our first phase of our project. So again, here we're looking at the literature, we're looking at climate reports, we're looking at documents for New York State, and we're seeing what are really the threats and hazards that are of most concern. And in conversation with the county, we really had to start thinking about not only, if that threat or hazard is going to impact us, but also sort of how relevant is it to the county in terms of its jurisdiction and its responsibilities. So based on this, you're seeing this meatball chart that we call it. in terms of the high, medium, and low aspects for all the columns. So how frequent will these threats or hazards impact us? How relevant is to the county jurisdiction, and what's sort of the expected impact? And based on these categories, you can see the top threats that are highlighted in red are the ones that we are focusing on for this climate vulnerability assessment. Now, I won't have time to talk about all of these today. I'm just going to talk about some of the results for the first two, for the temperature and precipitation categories. Okay, and so I just wanted to quickly show you kind of what we're concerned about for temperature and for precipitation. So for our region, we're really concerned about extreme heat. We're a place that has an old housing stock. A lot of folks don't have access to air conditioning. And so as we have the expected more extreme heat waves, higher temperature within those heat waves coming our way, this is really a concern for the county. And so what you're seeing here on the slide is a chart that shows both the observed and also the projected or the anticipated number of days over 90 degrees for Buffalo, New York. You can see that it's very much expected to increase over time over the coming century. And how bad this gets really depends upon the greenhouse gas scenario that you look at. So in red, you're looking sort of at the worst case scenario with higher greenhouse gas emissions. And in the sort of orange colors, the lower emission scenario. So if we're able to put renewable energy initiatives in and reduce our emissions, we'll see less of an impact on that. But you can see towards the end, right, of the scenario here, we could have 3 or more days over 100 degrees here locally in Buffalo, New York. We have never had a recorded day over 100 degrees yet here in the county. So this is a pretty significant change heading our way. In terms of precipitation, you're probably familiar with this. In recent years, we've seen increases in extreme precipitation. So this chart is just kind of showing you that. So on the y-axis is the number of precipitation events greater than 2 inches in a 24-hour period. And then you're seeing time along the x-axis. You can see in recent years, we're really seeing this increase in the number of these events greater than 2 inches. We have to start thinking about how do we become more prepared for that. So I'm just gonna quickly go through it. I noticed we don't have a lot of time. Some of the results of our sensitivity work here related to extreme heat and flooding. So you're gonna see a lot of maps here. So this work was done through spatial analysis and geographical information systems to just spatially show you the results of our work. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details here, but essentially we looked at how sensitive different parts of the county are to extreme heat based on a variety of landscape factors. So factors that sort of act to cool the local area and warm the local area. And you can kind of see parts that are much more urban areas here are considered more sensitive to extreme heat. And a lot of that has to do with being near a lot of areas that are paved, near major roadways, and not a lot of vegetation. So in terms of socioeconomic sensitivity, we looked again at a variety of different factors here: economic sensitivity, health factors, whether or not you're disabled or socially isolated, whether you live in older housing stock. And so here what you're seeing is, again, sort of this very urban core of the county being highly sensitive to extreme heat because of the factors that are considered for socioeconomic sensitivity. Whereas the rural areas, you're seeing not as much sensitivity to these socioeconomic factors. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here so I don't run out of time. I also just wanted to quickly show you some information on flooding. Now, I don't want to get too technical here, but essentially this map is showing the results of local flooding, so ponding that results on roadways or in landscapes that can block roadways or cause problems in local communities based on the soil types across the county. So the colors here you're seeing are really depicted based on how well the soil in a particular area is able to infiltrate or kind of suck up the water when it rains. Also, certain soil types, right, if they don't infiltrate, they cause this runoff or a lot of water sort of running and then causing the ponding that I talked about before. So this map is kind of just showing the results of these different soil types and how that affects where we might see flooding when we have an extreme precipitation event. I'm going to skip through this a little bit. I'll just say here, we were able to do the same type of analysis, but also think about potential ways to improve the drainage of our landscape across the county. So things like green infrastructure, rain barrels, if we were able to do that across the county, we would see improvements in our sensitivity to extreme precipitation events. The final phase of our climate vulnerability assessment is adaptive capacity. This is what we're working on right now. This is really where we're having conversations with Erie County staff. And so what I've done here on the slide is just highlighted the different meetings that we've had with many different departments across the county. Departments focused on infrastructure, departments focused on humans and human health, also departments focused on natural systems and forestry, to really understand what are the current practices and thinking around these hazards that we've highlighted, to really understand sort of where the county is and its ability to adapt and mitigate some of these risks that we've identified through our assessment. So with that, man, that 15 minutes goes really quickly. I'd like to thank all of you for listening and being here today. I've got my email address here if you have other questions that you aren't able to ask today. I also just wanted to provide the link to the Erie County Climate Action page, because that is where all the results of our assessment are going to be published and provided as they come out over the next couple of months. There's also a public input survey there where you can go in and answer a few questions about your own concerns and experiences with climate change threats and hazards. And we will be looking at that and considering that and bringing that into our climate vulnerability assessment as much as we possibly can. With that, I'll end my part of the presentation and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Susan, that was perfect for this series, and you added your piece of the puzzle, if you will. We'd like to have JD ask the first questions, and I thank publicly JD for suggesting you as a speaker. And JD, what are you thinking in the meantime while you're asking that? I hope everybody else that has some questions will consider entering them in the chat box, and we'll get to those right after your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Susan. One was an observation. I was heartened by your repeated comment of, hey, I won't go into the detail. It's good to know there's detail behind all of this. And I can imagine that you could dig into the detail ad nauseum. So thanks for sparing us, but also thanks for validating that there is science behind all of this. And one of the scientists that I listened to is your colleague, Jason Briner out at the university. And, he goes up to the ice cap and does, core sampling and studying. And he actually thinks that climate, the heating of the Earth's surface temperature and the melting and the resulting weather and climate change is further along than maybe we're getting in the mainstream press. I happen to agree with him from others, just being a kind of a student of the game. So I guess the science, I like that slide where you had the meetings you've had with county officials. You can extrapolate, even though you may not have the similar meetings with the city or state, but are policymakers actually making, I know they're making some changes. I get that because I'm involved in our Outer Harbor Coalition and others, but to me, it seems not to, our response, as a community, it just seems to be woefully inadequate given the magnitude of what we're facing. What do you find? Are people incorporating the science, or are they just saying, yeah, and then going building the roads, bridges, tunnels, the buildings, hey, we need jobs, and so on and so forth. And, even the Outer Harbor, let's build, I'm not politicizing it or opinion, let's build an amphitheater out of there instead of a buffer to anyway. So that enough said by me. What's your perspective?
Well, all I can do is speak from my own experience. I mean, as a scientist, I see more and more folks like the county, like the city, doing more work with universities. That partnership is becoming more common and just a little bit easier. I think for a long time, that work wasn't valued in the academic, scholarly literature, but I think more and more, like my own department now is being created in sort of this idea that we want to make an impact locally and do work that, goes off campus and actually helps communities. And so I think we see more of a demand for that. So I do think it's happening more and more. Now, that being said, in our conversations with the county, very open to the work that we're doing. I will say I'll put some of the blame, I think, on myself and academics, and that we're not the best at always putting things in a way that's easily digestible by someone who, who's a practitioner, who is out day to day working with people. They're not able to read all the scientific papers all the time, right? And I think we as academics can do a better job of distilling it down and providing more digestible and accessible ways for decision makers to bring the science into those decisions and policies in an easier way. Right now, I think they have to do too much work to do that. So I think we're headed in the right direction, but the academics can lean in a little bit more and provide that information in a more accessible way.
Yeah. Last question from me, or at least for now, till we turn to the audience. And Dennis, there's actually been a fair amount written of Buffalo being a possible kind of climate refuge, and what do you think that if you were the boss, what would be the number one thing you'd do to ensure that we progress, adapt to make ourselves just that, a climate refuge?
Well, I think, and actually in some of our reports, we refer to this notion of, Western New York being a climate refuge. And I think, relatively that to some of the threats and hazards that are facing a lot of the other, parts of the nation, that certainly, could be true. So I don't know if I was in charge, I think we need to still pay very close attention to the problems that we have here. I mean, relatively, maybe they're smaller, but I think for Western New York, you just looking at the socioeconomic, maps to extreme heat. I mean, we've got real issues with vulnerable populations. If the extreme, heat waves come our way, we are very vulnerable, I think, to those types of events. And if we're not able to deal with the population that we already have here and adapt, sort of mitigate those risks, how are we going to do that with people sort of coming to this part of the country, right? We'll have more people, maybe more diversity in the people that are here, a lot more complication in terms of the factors of sensitivity. And so I think we got to keep our mind, the future there, but also keep in mind that we still have some issues I think we have to address to be ready, even if we don't become a climate refuge. Right. And if we do that, we'll be just that much better prepared for when the influx of folks coming from other areas.
Thanks, Susan.
Very good. Leah, how are we doing for questions?
We do not have any questions.
And we will have a wonderful conversation and carry on from here. And if some come in, Leah, please, alert me. But I'll follow up with JD's question in effect. He and I are not scientists, but at least you're connected with those folks that are the scientists. It just seems that all the projections that we made, the attempts at trying to keep under 1.5 degrees centigrade goals of the Paris treaties and those initiatives, maybe we're at 1.1, 1.2, I hear different numbers. The timetables suddenly all emotionally got accelerated in the last couple of weeks, it seems. And the visuals of flooding in China and Indonesia, just things that, and I think back to Houston, a fairly flat area getting dumped on with maybe a foot plus, maybe 18 inches of rain in a short time. And then I think of Buffalo, fairly flat area, and saying, are we building into the studies you're doing? What if we had a foot of rain? How about 18 inches of rain in a 24-hour period? How would that look to our city, our region? Does it all flow nicely into Lake Erie, or do we have a problem? Are those questions being asked? And the reason I'm saying that is the acceleration feeling that things are accelerating faster than the computer projections a few years ago might have given us. That includes a pandemic where the world basically shut down for a year and a half or so, and is just starting to rev back up. So I'm thinking, wow, in that environment, if it's accelerating, what might it be doing as far as an economic acceleration as the pandemic hopefully recedes, with some interruptions, obviously, with Delta strains included. Get the gist of my question, see what you can do with that for a bit.
Yeah. I mean, so I see two approaches to thinking about, vulnerability to climate change. There's one that's kind of known as the risk-based approach, which is really use climate models, you look at the trends, you look at the past as an indication of the future, and you can come out with a mathematical, here's the risk that we have to this certain flooding event in the future. And that's the way a lot of folks, do their planning, because there's some evidence behind it. There's an actual scenario that's being thought about. The problem is, I think, as you point out, Dennis, is that things are accelerating. The past is not always the best indication of what's happening in the future. These are complicated. Our atmosphere is a very complicated system, and things are interacting and changing in ways that we just don't even comprehend in some ways, right? Even the most renowned scientists right now. And we can do the best we can to come up with, most likely scenarios. But the other approach, I think, is really what I would refer to more as like sort of planning to fail and sort of knowing that things are going to go awry. There's going to be pandemics. There are going to be these things that we just sort of never really think might even come our way. And you create systems and communities that are just able to respond no matter what comes their way, right? So it's not risk-based, but it's sort of like almost like an all hazards approach to thinking about resilience. And it comes to like, what if this craziest scenario would happen? What would we do? Would we be prepared? Maybe it's not realistic to think of that scenario, but just going through the exercise and talking about it and thinking about it collaboratively will help us become better prepared for all kinds of stuff that ends up coming our way, right? And so, I don't know, different people go in different camps of how they think about these things. But a lot of the work that we're doing with the county is a lot more of this what if kind of thinking. We're hoping to get a grant after the climate vulnerability assessment to focus on heat emergency planning. And so it's not flooding like you mentioned, Dennis, but it is sort of this, let's imagine a scenario where we have a strong heat wave and we have some power outages at the same time or something, right? And how then do we deal with cooling centers that maybe right now don't have backup generation systems? What are we going to do with vulnerable populations, and where can we send them in the event of a power outage, happening at the same time as a heat wave? So we got to think through these different scenarios and figure out how we're going to deal with those situations. And we're starting to do more and more of that.
Good. Leah, did we provoke any other questions?
Yes, we do. What can individual homeowners and neighborhoods do to adapt to climate change in our region?
Yeah.
That's a good one. Often a lot of this stuff, especially from the county level, is sort of geared towards these big institutions and, that have resources and can kind of in this much more strategic way. I think the number one thing people, individuals and households can do is just become more aware, know if your house could be prone to flooding. Maybe you're not in a place where you have to have flood insurance, but, be aware of if you're a place that if a really, big storm hits, you want to be prepared for that. You want to have a pump in your basement, not running out to Home Depot when it happens. Be aware of the critical facilities around you. Know where your, local urgent care is, and so when something happens that's unexpected, you yourself and your household is more prepared to kind of help yourself through that situation. So just having awareness of kind of like where you are, what your risks are, and then taking action to kind of mitigate those risks. I think that's the number one thing that a household can do at this point.
Thank you.
Hey, the yang to that, what we can do, as individuals that has a limited scope, we have limited budgets. I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum. There's this infrastructure bill that will come in some way, shape, or form that there'll be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars coming to Western New York. In your work, have you been called upon as, the political subdivisions, let's say the county specifically, is considering how to invest their money?
I have not yet been called upon, through the state specifically. I am working on some projects that informs the Department of Energy. So this is more federally, funds looking, for example, to invest in infrastructure in Puerto Rico, post Hurricane Maria. There's a lot of money headed that way. And so we're doing some work with them and much more on the social science side to think about how do we sort of mitigate the impacts of power outages on really vulnerable communities in places like Puerto Rico, but also places like Texas, right? Where earlier this year had that winter storm in February that, folks were without power for like a week. And so we're looking at some of the really social implications of those things with the notion that that will inform better infrastructure investments, like mitigate the burdens that vulnerable households and communities experience during those outages. So it'd be great if that work could inform stuff more locally, but I have yet to be, I'm not involved in that yet.
Thank you.
Susan, Leah, first of all, any other questions?
No other questions.
Okay, good. Susan, you run the master's program at UB, and I want you to at least mention that, because when everybody seems to indicate, our previous speakers, Ryan McPherson from UB mentioned their leadership role. The county has mentioned its leadership role. We're unique to have a private sector group. That's what J.D. Hartman is a member of and representing in this program, where the private sector is trying to take a leadership role. So in that leadership, it makes sense that a master's program, a graduate program at the university would be most important as we gain this reputation as a climate refuge, if you will, but also a center for education, lifelong learning in this field. Comment on that, please.
Yeah. So it's called a Master's in Sustainability Leadership, which I think is really important because, yes, you get sort of the foundational, context around sustainability as sort of just like a knowledge about sustainability, but it also teaches you to communicate and lead and sort of make an influence either on your organization or community. So it's not just about having the knowledge, but how you can actually like be a change maker in whatever sort of circle that you work in. And so our program is a little bit distinct because we have those components to that. So yes, it's a new program. We're in our second year right now. It's growing a lot faster than we ever, had imagined, which is a good problem to have, by the way. And yeah, we're just seeing some of our first graduates really right now. And so far, students have had great experiences. They're doing project-based learning as part of this project. So they're, working with folks like Erie County on impactful local projects. And so we're really looking forward to see how our students can kind of make that like local impact based on their projects in the program, and see where these students end up going and actually hopefully creating change. So yeah, if anybody wants to know specifics about the program, I'd be happy to talk to you more about that in detail.
I'm assuming it's online someplace at the university's department or your information. Is there a quick website that you can mention?
Yeah, so if you go to the University of Buffalo website and navigate, so our department is Environment and Sustainability. It's within there, all of our programs are listed, included the Masters in Sustainability Leadership.
Perfect. Well, it's time to wrap it up. And again, Susan, thank you. You gave the perfect presentation for this series. And I invite people to go to the library's YouTube link, and you can see all the programs, all the Imagine programs. We've had a lot of people watching them. We see get monthly reports, and between YouTube and Facebook, this program is gaining a pretty good amount of popularity and viewing time. So we thank you for joining us today. Now, next week, we'll go back to the nonprofit sector, and Michelle Urbanchik, who's the executive director of the Explore and More Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Children's Museum, will be speaking. They have exhibits tied to sustainability, and we're hoping that that can only grow. I'll also mention that they're part of the Waterfront Wednesday Children Free program tied to the Miss Buffalo 2 tours on Wednesday afternoon, and the Naval and Military Park, and the Heritage Carousel, along with Explore and More, are all connected. Look for that. Children 12 and under are free, one with each paying adult that joins them on starting with the Miss Buffalo 2, the landmark cruise that I offer actually on Wednesdays, 2 and 4 o'clock. So that's one mention. The other is once a year we have a Buffalo Day at Chautauqua, and this Friday is Buffalo Day at Chautauqua. It's a virtual program at 3 o'clock. You can go to Chautauqua's website. Their topic was the foundation for this program, actually. They're exploring this week at Chautauqua, building a culture of empathy. And we have 2 local speakers. We're coming at it from the faith standpoint. We have Father Judd, a well-known Franciscan in the area, part of the Slow Roll program on the side, but he'll be speaking about St. Francis and how that is at the core of a culture of empathy. And then the recently retired Reverend Tom Yorty from Westminster will be speaking on Schweitzer's reverence for life ethic. So if you can join us on that, that's at 3 o'clock. Again, go to their link and it'll be archived as well. So I'm Dennis Galecki. Thank you again so much to our speakers and as well as our viewing audience and to you in the greater Buffalo area and beyond. Be well and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Susan.